Another year in gaming has come and gone, and 2015 certainly had no shortage of high-profile releases. But the question as we look back remains, what games truly made this a special year? What stood apart from the pack and really made a name for itself? What games earned their spot in our hearts and memories? Besides, of course, Devil's Third. Well, hell if I know, but I can sure tell you which one stood out to me. So here we go. These are my 10 favorite games of 2015. Now let me preface this by saying that I don't necessarily think all these games are perfect, and if you disagree, I certainly don't hold that against you. So this is really more of a personal assessment rather than a definitive hard and fast ruling. If a game you love isn't on there, well, just remember it's nothing personal. Honestly, there were a lot of games I really enjoyed for one reason or another, and narrowing this list down naturally meant a lot of those got left on the wayside. It's just the reality of self-indulgent list making in a vacuum, to be fair. So, without further ado, let's jump in there, shall we? Number 10. Rodea the Sky Soldier for Wii, Wii U, and Nintendo 3DS. The story of how the latest game from Yuji Naka, the Sega luminary who created Sonic the Hedgehog, finally came out is an odd one to be sure. Originally developed as a Wii game near the end of the console's life cycle, Rodea the Sky Soldier was completed for that console in 2011, but put on the back burner while Probe worked on a 3DS and additionally a Wii U port, which 4 years later is what finally arrived in the US. The real surprise here is that in apparent hope of shuffling the Wii version off, the initial print of the Wii U port comes with the original included for free. Maybe they should have at least given the Wii version a chance to stand on its own, because Rodea, while imperfect, definitely has a strong identity of its own and a rock-solid game holding it up too. It's apt that the game's advertised as being from the man behind Sonic and Nights into Dreams, because that's almost exactly what Rodea the Sky Soldier is. It combines the Nights game's flight-focused movement with Sonic's approach to combat and exploration, wrapped up in a charming visual design with more than a few inspirations taken from Skies of Arcadia. The game looks rough to be sure. Those hoping for the fidelity and detail of late-era Wii games like Last Story, or Xenoblade Chronicles, or Mario Galaxy 2 won't be impressed here, but the environments are varied and colorful, and it holds up impressively well on a frame rate level considering how much can be going on at once. The compromise of how Rodea's flight mechanic works is that it's more or less on a rail. You use the B button on the Wiimote to select almost any point within a certain range, then the direction you flick it will cause Rodea to fly there in an arc, and he moves at a set speed that can be increased with his very Sonic-like homing attack. So it's more or less a string of homing attacks that double as traversal. Where this gets interesting is in the details, however. Since there's no way to cancel out of a flight path outside of pointing to another location and going there, you're encouraged to spend almost all of your time airborne, and the game's fall speed is deliberately impossibly slow to allow you for more time to gather your bearings and maneuver to safety if you lose momentum. And the value of the Wiimote as a pointing device makes this simple setup easy to grasp and astoundingly reliable once you've learned its mechanics. And it's here that the real charm of Rodea's design comes through. Naka's games have always been about intuitive motion as their central conceit, and seeing a game fit so snugly around its central concept the way Rodea does really evokes the classic way that mascot games and mascot platformers in particular were designed not so long ago. And the consistently clever ways the game utilizes our hero's particular skill set is refreshing. In one part of the game, there's a bomber you have to stop, but it's way above you and far outside your flight range. So you have to fly towards its falling bombs and use them as a stepping stone to get high enough to attack the bomber itself. And in another, you have to use debris from a boss's super laser weapon to pull yourself in to attack its weak spot while still avoiding getting hit. The game caps off your abilities with 3 distinct power-ups: a machine gun, dash boots, and a multi-lock weapon that looks, well, like a DBZ Scouter, and while only 2 of them are actually really useful, the game manages to find a nice interplay between your abilities and enemies that exist to counter certain aspects of your moveset with these power-ups, and the synergy makes for some really engaging moments. Aside from a very throwaway plot, which is going to be a very your mileage may vary situation, personally, while it's unquestionably very rote, I found the Saturday morning cartoon vibe very fitting and really kind of charming. The game's major flaw is an iffy camera, along with maybe a few too many find the item or enemy out of a haystack situations. The other downside is that the definitive version of the game is very likely now all but impossible to find, and the Wii U 3DS port plays out almost like a parody of how a modern marketing team would feel like the game would need to be changed to sell. Limited flight with a sluggish control scheme, upgrade trees, a washed out drab palette. And it's really a shame that they didn't at least try to draw from the Wii original instead of building a new version for the 3DS and porting that to Wii U instead. But even with all that, Rodea makes for an endearing unique action platformer, and even with its shaky development history, one can hope this isn't the last we've seen of this promising new little IP. Number 9. Transformers Devastation for PC, Xbox One, Xbox 360, PlayStation 4, and PlayStation 3. Platinum never loses its luster. To be sure, quality can vary between their small but strong roster of games since their formation in 2006, but one thing that sets them apart and makes every last one of those titles special is a genuine sense of love that only the best developers can understand and even fewer can wear on their sleeves. And Platinum's enthusiasm for Transformers comes on very strong in Devastation. From its dead-on cel-shaded art direction to its equally dead-on nonsense story, it's clear Platinum understands why they themselves love this series, and why they felt their distinct brand of character-based action gameplay could fit in. And boy, were they right. If you follow their tics and tendencies from when Bayonetta formed the new hotness mold out of the primordial ooze of Devil May Cry's Old and Busted, there's a real sense of satisfaction that comes with seeing the careful iteration of the self-proclaimed greatest action games developers of our time, refining the now familiar but strong skeleton of their approach to combat. Devastation comes to us from Kenji Saito, creator of the best Metal Gear game of the last 3 years, so Revengeance's frantic speed comes most clearly into play, married this time to Bayonetta's dodging-based defensive maneuvering, and the quirks of the Wonderful 101's broader cast of playable characters that largely control the same but have just enough distinction between their individual feel that choosing who to actually stick with warrants genuine consideration. Even though the handful of weapon classes are compatible generally across the board, there's a tangible difference between Optimus Prime's weightier strikes and Bumblebee's extra maneuverability, or Sideswipe's better ability to string together combo finishers. It even allows for surprisingly weird variants like Grimlaw, whose slower but more powerful Dinobot form and command grab focused counter-centric playstyle made him really hard for me to gel with, but even so I greatly appreciate not only that he's there, but how much a reflection it is of Platinum's attention to not only detail, but to the character itself that they would go to so much trouble to implement that, and do it in such a way that he still feels balanced with the rest of the cast. In fact, now that we know a Ninja Turtles game is incoming probably sometime in 2016, maybe this was a way of experimenting in preparation for this? Speaking of prior preparation, the new gameplay loop in the mix this time is random loot drops. I'm not saying they're nailing this down for Scalebound on the horizon, but that's exactly what I'm saying. And while I normally can't get too excited about RNG stuff, especially when it comes to equipment and games, I can't deny that it's really strongly implemented and crazy easy to get sucked into in Devastation. Like with the EDF games, drops scale and improve with your difficulty in both rarity and stats, and with how much on the higher levels the gulf between a rank B and a rank A weapon can get. There's plenty of incentive to throw yourself in there and find something either stronger or with a unique property to take advantage of. And once you get the gist of how feeding weapons into each other and passing on special traits operates, it really feels like you're making distinct super weapons to fit your playstyle that still operate along clear movesets and styles. It actually reminds me quite a bit of the excellent weapon fusion system in Kid Icarus Uprising, and it pairs really nicely with Platinum's till now more definite approach to weapon design. It could certainly use a more refined method of sorting and categorizing every single weapon you get, granted, but still. While definitely longer than Korra, but shorter than Revengeance, Devastation isn't the sprawling TTGL-style epic that Wonderful 101 was, but it makes up for that by engendering plenty of replayability through its roster and weapon creation, along with the fact that it's quite tough but generally fair. Some of these fights can be absolutely brutal, especially when your weapons are evenly to undermatched the first time through or so, but none of them feel like game breakers or anything that couldn't be solved by going with a character who lines up closer to your own playstyle. I'm all about that Bumblebee reversal movement myself. At the end of the day, Transformers Devastation is a Platinum game through and through, and while the formula is starting to wear for some, it's hard to deny that the value of mastery over a specific discipline speaks for itself, and dang it, Platinum just understands how to make an action game that just feels genuinely good to play from a basic control standpoint, to the little flourishes that make each hit impactful and satisfying, and especially when the genre is so generally underserved, and its other patrons can be so unreliable at best, that matters. In a lot of ways, Devastation is, well, more than meets the eye, not just for licensed games or the Transformers series itself, but it is a worthy entry in an excellent catalog of work. Number 8, Life is Strange for PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, PC, PlayStation 4, and Xbox One. The inner workings of the lives of high schoolers and young adults in general are well-tread territory for movies and books and even comics, but with a few exceptions, video games haven't really attempted to explore in depth the fertile ground of coming-of-age stories. Apparently, Don't Nod, developers of the charming but imperfect Remember Me, felt the same way, and through Life is Strange we get an equally charming but equally imperfect episodic adventure game. Life is Strange's points of inspiration, from Freaks and Geeks all the way to Twin Peaks, are all over the place on paper, but it's impressive how cohesive it all feels, and more importantly, how strong its cast of characters are. While much has been made of the game's sometimes questionable moment-to-moment dialogue, the actual character writing is strong, and a genuine treat in a medium where all too often, complexity and ambiguity are a necessary sacrifice for the sake of satisfying gameplay. Not one of them, from Nathan Prescott to Mark Jefferson or Victoria Chase, and especially not Chloe Price, are 100% who we think they are from the outset. And the real net benefit of the game's Prince of Persia time rewind conceit is that it often allows us to explore them or aspects of themselves we otherwise might not see. And it's a strong reminder of how while not every game needs to have a great story, the interactive nature of games can do things that, when used properly, other mediums can't do nearly as well. These people have a real authenticity and humanity to them that makes them all genuinely worth caring about, and even with a pretty hard fumble at the finish line, that's still a worthy accomplishment, especially in a story-based title. Through solid visual direction, and especially an on-point soundtrack, Life is Strange manages to perfectly capture its Donnie Darko by way of Daniel Clow's sense of place and time, and shifts in tone from light and relaxed to genuinely dire feel organic and earned. And while, again, the ending is definitely not a not undeserved point of contention even now, the final chapter itself is certainly a thing to behold on its own merits. As Max desperately exhausts the depths of her powers to try and avert the final disaster, it goes full throttle into probably the closest we'll get to another Silent Hill game that isn't on a pachinko machine. Ultimately, the destination of Life is Strange is something of a toss-up, but the trip getting there is a memorable, thoughtful, and genuinely emotional one worth taking. The thing about so many of these episodic adventure games is that all of them promise you that your choices will matter, and in the end they certainly seem, and in the moment they certainly seem to, but very rarely outside of momentary detours do your choices have meaningful long-term consequences. And while Life is Strange falls into that trap like many of its peers, the fact that it decides to take that reality and make it a core part of its thematic main text is equal parts frustrating and clever, and maybe nothing sums up Life is Strange better. I may not have been particularly happy with the line in the sand that the game ends up drawing, but that I cared as much as I did about it might be more important. Number 7, Until Dawn for PlayStation 4. Sincerity feels like a rare thing to find in media anymore, especially with a scenario as ripe for smug self-awareness as the perennial slasher film setup of a group of horny teenagers, or at least 30-somethings pretending to be teenagers, in an isolated cabin in the woods with sinister forces conspiring to get them all dead. And it's this genuinely satisfying kind of subversion, that is, not being subversive at all, that makes Until Dead stand out not just as an adventure game with clear cinematic aspirations and inspirations, but within the genre it cherry-picks so blatantly from. You keep expecting there to be some too clever by half twist to justify itself, but one of the best things about Supermassive Games' take on the setup is how authentically affectionate it is about the kinds of films it's borrowing from, and that its writing team has a background in schlocky horror films themselves certainly helps. All the classic archetypes are here. Your jock, your ice queen, your not Buffy hero character, the pair eager to get into each other's pants that's probably also going to die first. But what's surprising is how much work has gone into making them feel like real people, or at least as close to real people as you can get in B horror. Buoyed by really strong mocap work and witty dialogue that carefully avoids falling into trite Whedonisms, you get just enough out of each person that being invested in and trying to get them all out alive feels earned, but not so much that if you happen to be the type of horror fan who's in it for the grisly kills, well, you'll probably walk away satisfied as well. Like many entries in the modern adventure game genre, Until Dawn warned you about the consequences of your actions, and while the story will follow a lot of the same beats no matter what, the vulnerable nature of the 6 protagonists actually has some impact, especially as the game gets closer to the end and the punishments for failing QTEs or making the wrong choice in a seemingly innocuous situation become more severe. Sometimes it's hard to tell what the best choice is until you've already failed it. Even so, the game goes at a snappy enough pace that playing through it at least once or twice more doesn't feel like a chore, especially thanks to the option to pick up from specific chapters after completing the main game, so you can follow different branching paths. And seeing just how much some characters' survival is dependent on you making the right choices with other characters helps everyone feel intermeshed in a really interesting way. My personal favorite design choice, though, is how the game's assortment of collectibles and lore details actually has a major impact on how aware certain characters can become about the situation, or even start to piece things together on their own. It feels like such a smart, subtle bit of extra incentive to actually track these things down, especially when most of the time these things are just there for an achievement or something. Until Dawn is hardly high art in the loftier sense of the term, and definitely feels more than a little backward with how it handles certain characters, but it's an extremely well-crafted love letter to 80s and 90s horror, and really just a fun exercise in seeing how well this kind of game can do with a sense of clear focus and a team on board that's clearly putting the work in and that cares about the craft of the thing itself. Slasher film trappings and choose-your-own-adventure game design getting paired up feels like such a no-brainer in retrospect. That's amazing it took this long to happen, but wow, am I glad it finally did. Number 6, Soma on PC and PlayStation 4. In 2010, Frictional Games released a little indie horror game called Amnesia: The Dark Descent, which instantly became a critical and commercial success that also, not their fault, ushered in the age of facecam LPers playing horror games. Intentional or not, their newest game, Soma, brought certain expectations with it when it finally arrived. The end result is a game that lacks no shortage of good old-fashioned being unarmed and hiding from insta-kill monsters, but decidedly isn't quite a horror game. At least not one that lends itself quite as well to a more photogenic kind of scares, for lack of a better term. Aside from a very similar core gameplay and movement skeleton, and Frictional's very distinct ability to craft atmosphere in remote, shadowy settings, Soma is almost nothing like its hallowed Cthulhu-inspired predecessor. And that's not a bad thing. Soma chooses instead to go futuristic, shifting its literary focuses from good old Lovecraft to Asimov and Clarke, and if either of those names rings a bell, it'll certainly give you a good idea of what you're in for. While monsters are definitely present and accounted for, that's not really the root of the scares that Soma is zeroed in on. Instead, it dwells on a raw, existential kind of fear, and its pervasiveness settles into your thoughts in the pit of your stomach as you progress, the hopelessness of your situation, and the feared nature of your hopeful victory ever present in a way that many games with similar apocalyptic scenarios all somehow fail to convey. Considering especially how grounded the game begins and how on-paper fantastical it becomes, that it can maintain this crushing tone, even alleviated slightly with occasional friendly companionship and smatterings of dry gallows humor, and make it convincing is no small thing. In addition to its existential ponderings, those with a strong aversion to body horror and dissociative experiences should definitely be careful. Some of the game's later sequences especially had me deeply perturbed, and I wouldn't say I'm particularly bothered by that kind of thing, but then in most games, you just see people turn into weird giants with tentacle arms and glowing weak spots, not quite, well, some of what you get in Soma. While not quite in space, the existence of well-made, well-written, and cleverly thought-out future horror, especially right after 2013's excellent Alien Isolation, is a very welcome thing, and even with the base-level premise expecting you to accept a lot early on, the scenario still manages to paint believable pictures within the context of its own universe, and still some fantastically creepy setups. Those looking for a more cathartic take on horror might leave someone feeling a bit disappointed, but for those who felt a void in their hearts, like me, since the death of the Dead Space series, and who have a fondness for well-realized, big-question sci-fi stories, Soma is one game that will definitely tide you over. Number 5. Fast Racing Neo for Wii U. Check the body of late 90s, early aughts futuristic high-speed arcade racers for a pulse. It's not dead yet, and leave it to brand new studio Shinen Media for shocking it back to life with the defibrillator. The point I'm trying to make is that if you miss this genre as much as I did, Fast Racing Neo is a godsend. FRN falls somewhere on the spectrum between Wipeout's kind of fast style with sleek, narrow racer designs and mega corporation subtext, and F-Zero's blistering fast style with twisting, dynamic track design, with elements of Ikaruga and Star Wars Pod Racer of all things thrown in for good measure. The end result is the white-knuckled split-second driving and imaginative tracks that you come into this genre for, beautifully realized and appreciably diverse, while still bearing the hallmarks you want to be there. Missing Big Blue? Oh, Fast Racing Neo has you covered. There's not much in the way of combat, though the shield that comes with boosting will let you spin out other racers briefly, which can lead to sending people off the track or into hazards and gives a nice sense of kineticism to the action. And there are two ways you can get that all-around helpful boost: by collecting energy or by switching the polarity of your racer to take advantage of matching color jumps and boost strips. This adds a nice active element that adds just enough extra to keep track of that it feels incredibly satisfying once you get the patterns down, and really makes those last second victories all the more thrilling. There isn't much extra to the game aside from full online multiplayer and 4-player split screen, along with the old standbys like time trials and ghosts, but for $15 for what amounts to a full price racing game package, it's a hard deal to pass up. If you've been lamenting the fact that Nintendo have been dragging in their heels on a new F-Zero game since the GameCube, Fast Racing Neo may not fully make up for it, but it's the next best thing, and that's no small compliment. Number 4. Rise of the Tomb Raider, which is a timed exclusive for Xbox One and Xbox 360, arriving on PC in spring 2016 and on PlayStation 3 and PlayStation 4 in winter 2016. I walked away from Crystal Dynamics' 2013 Tomb Raider reboot with mixed but overwhelmingly positive feelings. The shift to a unified location, broken into hubs, with an emphasis on Metroid-style exploration and item-based pathfinding, with light survival and crafting elements, felt like a strong new gameplay focus for the series. But the push into hard M rating territory, in terms of violent spectacle with a weirdly lurid focus on Laura's grisly deaths, undeniably took some of the sense of fun out of what has always been a more lighthearted action-adventure series. What made the whole package work for me, though, was how it played with expectations both in terms of who gets to survive and turning the video game staple of the damsel in distress trope on its head. Laura and her extended cast were well realized and genuinely likable, for the most part, and honestly I was excited to see more of this new take on Laura and how she would interact with this group of characters in the future. Rise of the Tomb Raider, by contrast, doesn't really give us much of that, sadly, but as much as the loss of this humanizing element definitely colors the sequel, the spirit of pulp adventure comes back with a vengeance, and that strong gameplay loop returns even better and more involving than before. There's no denying that Rise is just a really solid sequel that brings back Laura's classic adventures, colored by the more complex characterization of her reimagined incarnation. The story here is a dead ringer for Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade, and genre-savvy players will fit the pieces together probably quicker than the game wants them to, but the delivery is so confident that tagging along for the ride is still fun without being tired. It's the game design here that stands out, and Crystal Dynamics has built nicely on top of the strong establishment from the 2013 reboot, and added a greater range of combat options, abilities, traversal methods, and incentives for hunting and gathering. It seems that nature does abhor a vacuum after all, as since Ubisoft can't be bothered with the Prince of Persia series anymore, Lara Croft is picking up the slack herself. Indeed, there's a really nice flow to the platforming this time around, and just enough variety to keep track of that getting around becomes enjoyable in its own regard, especially when it comes down to some of the more devious puzzles of the new challenge tombs. The crafting and hunting elements, now more intertwined and specific than the vague salvage setup from the last game, provide a constant incentive to track down specific animals and gather what you can from the area, either for upgrading tools or ammo reserves or to pair with certain throwable items to make Last of Us style improvised weaponry. Stealth is often more of an actual option, assuming you can do it correctly, than it was in the last game if you want, but it's hard to ignore how satisfying some of these new tricks are to use, and while the combat still has weird problems when enemies get too close, it maintains a nice pace and frantic nature that doesn't get translated across in a lot of stop and pop cover shooters. Rise of the Tomb Raider's hub areas feel just big enough to be worth exploring, but not so big that they aren't reasonably dense with stuff to find and reasons to go off the beaten path. Even the handful of side quests you can do offer significant upgrades, so it never hurts to go for them. Rise of the Tomb Raider isn't quite what I hoped it would be, but even so it's hard to deny that it's still a great Tomb Raider game, and a nice return to the sensibilities of the original games while bringing in its own style. I'm really looking forward to Laura's next adventure, but it'll be good once everyone else gets to play this one. Number 3. Splatoon for Wii U. People often complain about Nintendo's over-reliance on their classic series and unwillingness to make new IP, but it isn't for lack of trying, it's just that people usually ignore their new series and buy games for their classic series. Look at Wonderful 101! So it's a genuine treat then for Nintendo's first foray into competitive online-focused third-person shooter-type games that everyone actually got on board. If Splatoon was merely a solidly designed third-person shooter with a cute Nintendo visual theme and a lack of blood and violence, that might have been enough, but Splatoon isn't content with being just that. Instead, it's a bold reworking of the base tenets of the genre, wrapped up with a unique and utterly charming marine life by way of Jet Set Radio aesthetic. Peppered liberally with enough 90s catchphrases, you have expect the Ninja Turtles and Street Sharks to be unlockable classes. It's a vibrant and lively in ways that you don't expect a post-apocalyptic shooter to be, and the Inklings are such an instantly iconic design that slides right into the canon of Nintendo's classic mascot characters. Splatoon contributes to its normally grimy and hyper-masculine genre, come across through its core game design from the ground up. Since victory comes from who can spread the most colored ink on the floor of each stage before 3 minutes is up, the way you play, which ties into its small but distinct set of weapon classes, becomes wholly different. And while taking out other players can provide a small brief advantage, kill counts don't contribute anything to the team's final score, and coordinating based on your weapons becomes far more important. The roller might be tailor-made for spraying ink quickly on a large scale, but a skilled team with only splatter shots can turn the tide against you faster than you might expect. You'd think with the necessity for teamwork, the game's lack of voice chat would be an actual problem, but the game does such a good job of providing you with information at all times through the gamepad, it honestly isn't missed. And frankly, the meme hell that the game's main hub and in-stage billboards represent is a lot more fun to wade through than muting some rando's music filtering through their mic or a string of sexist or racist epithets. The other trick Splatoon has up its sleeve is how fast it is, and how easy it is to get back into the action and keep the tension for each match high. You can teleport to any active teammate from either the starting spawn point or out in the field, but the real advantage comes from the game's much touted ability to be a kid now or a squid now. Your base speed in humanoid form is slow, with a crappy little jump, but the ability to use your weapons, whereas squids can go much faster through same colored ink, as well as climb up walls or hide behind while standing still and set ambushes. This dynamic approach to movement and subsequent trade-off between speed and offense adds a great active dimension to the gameplay, and the small but often fantastic arena designs, both in terms of clever settings and what they contribute to the game's verticality and spacing, help add to the chaotic unpredictability of the game. Even if you think you're crushing the opposition, the balance of power can shift in an instant on both counts. Adding to that, not only is there a full single-player campaign, which, while a little threadbare, is still charming and adds some nice context to the immediately attention-grabbing world of Inkopolis. But while the game started out with a little bit on the lean side, the number of maps, weapons, and game modes has expanded dramatically from launch, thanks to regular, free updates. And no season pass in sight! How about that? The last couple years have seen a dramatic increase in multiplayer online-only oriented console games, but Splatoon represents a break from the norm that's not only encouraging to see, but a joy to play. It captures the intensity of multiplayer shooters and translates it into a fun for the whole family way that with plenty of that classic Nintendo charm. I don't think it's unrealistic to think that if they can keep it up, Splatoon can stay fresh for quite a while to come. Number 2, Bloodborne for PlayStation 4. Games don't often get much bleaker than Dark Souls, Hidetaka Miyazaki's haunting take on high fantasy, in which you play as, essentially, a nameless zombie navigating its way through the pantheon of once glorious Tolkien-esque universe on its last gasps, in an ultimately futile quest to keep the world spinning for a bit longer, in the face of a palpably inevitable collapse. It's basically Le Mort d'Arthur, except instead of fighting his illegitimate kid, Arthur's up against the he-death of the universe. And also, he's gonna die a lot getting there. Returning to the director's chair, Miyazaki and the brutally imaginative team behind that modern classic have brought us Bloodborne, and by shedding the fantasy trappings in favor of the horror genre as a whole, the Souls team proves they still have plenty of fresh, creepy, and unsettling ways to put players through the ringer and make them love them for it. From its early setup and distinctly gothic setting to its late-game reality-altering shenanigans, Bloodborne feels like a definitive ode to late 19th to mid-20th century horror fiction. From Dracula to the shadow over Innsmouth and all the bloodthirsty townsfolk, mysterious diseases, werewolves, witches, and old ones that implies. And while inspirations are taken freely, Bloodborne opts to bring all that together to craft its own unique mythos, and it's just as strange and deliciously vague as anything in Dark Souls. The focus setting of Yharnam, though, is what really gives it a life of its own. It feels modern and almost real, compared to Lordran at least, and there's a sense of pathos that comes with the idea that maybe only a few years earlier this place might not have been so bad. There's a real sense that people were here only just recently. But as you go further, you realize just how fleeting that hope was from the very moment you set out. While unquestionably difficult, in some ways Bloodborne might be the most accessible of the Souls-like games. There's a tighter group of stats to level, and all but casting shields aside, the game takes a faster, more frantic pace, and that shifts its focus into maneuverability and offense, with an occasional handy gunshot parry serving as a wholly unique last line of defense. Despite controlling almost identically, it gives the game a very different feel from previous Miyazaki titles, and the renewed focus on putting yourself out there and taking risks, embodied perhaps more than anything by the rally system, which encourages you to strike back after getting hit to make your health back quickly, makes quite a different impression than the more patient approach of Dark Souls' sword and board focus. The level design shines with the renewed focus on honeycomb-like areas consisting of carefully realized shortcuts and traps that might catch even the most seasoned veteran off guard. The art direction easily captures the somber yet hyper-stylized pulpy nature of this doomed city, and the bosses are some of the most visually impressive and satisfying to fight across any of the Souls games. With refined, appropriately bloodthirsty combat, and a grander while simultaneously more intimate story, Bloodborne stands apart as one of this year's best action RPGs, a worthy standalone candidate in Miyazaki's body of work, and a terrifying, head-twisting treat that is not to be missed. And my number one game of 2015 is Undertale for PC. Mimicking the visual style of retro games of the late 80s and the early 90s isn't an uncommon thing these days, but it's truly rare when you get a game that truly feels like it could have existed during that time, but paired with such modern sensibilities that it also could never have. A game that understands the power of nostalgia, but also offers something new, with a vision and a heart entirely its own. Shovel Knight felt like that game in 2014, an evocation of NES platformers like Castlevania and DuckTales and Zelda 2, and this year, heavily inspired by the cult classic Earthbound, it was Toby Fox's Undertale. Undertale feels like such a simple game from its outset, a straightforward story of a lost child navigating a strange labyrinth of monsters to find their way home. But it doesn't take long before we see how much more there is to it than just that. Over the course of only a few hours, you explore a small but incredibly well-realized universe, accompanied by rich, instantly memorable characters and writing that perfectly walks the line between genuinely funny comedy and earnest sadness, and that may be Undertale's greatest strength. It feels authentic in a way that so few games do, and its cast has so much nuance and dimension to them that even though some get more screen time than others, all of them convey a real sense of who they are and what they want, and while you might be an important catalyst, you're by no means the most crucial figure of importance in their lives. The game plays gleefully with your expectations and even the apparent base-level reliability of the systems themselves, subverting innocuous and even reflexive concepts and terminology of video games and RPGs in general in a way that actually feels clever rather than smart alecky, and also, more importantly, ties back into the core narrative and themes of Undertale. The game itself remembers everything you do, even if you try to slip out of consequences by dodging a game save, and while it laughs at some of these things, more often than not, it twists them into unsettling, unforgettable moments that go up there with Eternal Darknesses faking a save corruption or Psycho Mantis reading your memory card. And all this is tied together with a truly unique take on turn-based combat that fuses in bullet hell design of all things to make something that feels astoundingly thrilling and involving despite its rudimentary nature. It shouldn't work half as well as it does, but it really helps give Undertale its own sensibility, along with the crucial mercy options, which encourage you to really take each monster into consideration to figure out clever and often hilarious ways to defeat them without hurting them. I haven't even mentioned the music. Dear God, Undertale's soundtrack is a surprisingly complex, endlessly hummable thing of beauty. It weaves such a strong tapestry from setting up individual characters to an expert use of leitmotif, and there are few things more satisfying than hearing an innocuous early game tune come back full force in the climax. It's hard to deny Undertale's retro aspirations when it's so clearly and carefully constructed with such a singular vision. It's nearly impossible to imagine it any other way than the final results. But ultimately, Undertale really is a simple game at its very heart. It's a game about childhood and growing up, and love and friendship, and hate and loneliness and kindness and silliness and forgiveness, and how much those things matter even when it seems like nothing does. It's a game about finding the determination to go on through the darkest of times, knowing there's always the hope of something better through it all. It's a reminder of how games can speak to us entirely on their own terms, but also of why you cared about them in the first place. And that's what makes Undertale, for me at least, the best game of 2015.